Welcome to Taking Care of Lady Business, where we put the business back in lady business. Hosted by Jennifer Justice, founder and CEO of the Justice Department, a management strategy and law firm that works with female and woke male entrepreneurs, executives, talent, brands, and creatives to build and maximize their wealth, focusing in the areas of tech, consumer product, finance, media, entertainment, and fashion. Jennifer interviews entrepreneurial women who have done it all, who will be sharing their secrets on all things business, especially as a woman. These highly successful women will share strategies and insights, including what not to do and what it takes to win. And now, here's your host, Jennifer Justice.
Thanks to MedJet for supporting the Lady Business podcast. If you're hospitalized or your security is threatened while traveling, they can get you home. I'm a MedJet member and have been for years. Everyone who travels should be. Enroll before your next trip at medjet.com. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Taking Care of Lady Business. I am Jennifer Justice. Today, we have the lovely Kathryn Minshew. She is the CEO and founder of The Muse. And if you haven't heard of The Muse, we're going to hear all about it today and all of her journey, which is The Muse is now, 12 years old, did you say? That's crazy.
Yep, 12 years old.
Love it. Welcome. Thank you for being on this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So let's just dive right in and start by telling everyone what The Muse is, because if you don't know, I'm sure you're going to be a power user soon.
So I like to describe the Muse as a place for people who want to care about what they do. The perhaps more kind of investor-facing description would be a marketplace for values-aligned work, but essentially we're a new form of job search and career site. So we have on one side 6 to 8 million people every single month who come to themuse.com and our sister property, Fairygodboss.com. And people come to the sites to get career advice, to connect with each other, to research companies, and ultimately to apply to jobs. The Muse is focused on kind of anyone, regardless of race or gender, although we do tend to have a lot of women and a lot of people of color who use the site. Fairygodboss, which we acquired last fall, which I did not found. I founded the Muse 12 years ago. Last fall, we acquired Fairygodboss, which is one of the largest online career communities for women. So it also has a kind of very, very active forum product where women can ask and answer each other's career questions. And then both sites make money in a very similar way, which is, there are thousands of employers out there who are looking to hire. And particularly, I think we tend to work with companies that want to hire great people based on their company culture, their values. This idea of not just getting a butt in the seat, but getting the right person who's going to be an excited, productive, long-term member of your team. And so companies invest their time and their employees' time pretty heavily in giving us a lot of data and a lot of content about what it's really like to work at their businesses. For Fairygodboss, it's what it's like to be a woman at their companies. For the Muse, it's really across, all categories. What does it mean to be an engineer, a salesperson, an accountant, a marketing manager? And how should someone who's thinking about joining that company assess whether or not it's going to be a good fit? So the passion and the motivating principle, and I can talk about any of this in far more detail, but the sort of motivating principle is helping people love what they do and helping people find that right fit opportunity, both for their skills, but also their desires, their needs, right, the flexibility they want in their life. And for businesses, I think if you get great people who know what they're signing up for and are proactively opting in, that also means, and the data shows, that you're going to get longer tenured employees, more satisfied, more productive, more engaged, more happy employees. So lots of upside for both sides of the marketplace that we run.
And is it for all levels, like entry level all the way to C-suite? Where do you find the sweet spot of the applicants, basically?
Yeah, I would say most of the people who use the Muse are entry and mid-level, just because by the time someone becomes an executive, they're often finding a job through a recruiter, executive search, their network. We really specialize in the sort of first, let's say 15 years out of school.
Yeah.
So individual contributors, managers, directors, and those are also areas where, people really care about company culture and work environment, and they don't necessarily know someone at that company to ask, or they'd like to get a little bit more insight. for Fairygodboss, because the company focuses exclusively on helping women connect and network with each other, they have a slightly higher percentage of VPs and senior executive women who use the site really focused on that female experience.
So what led you to this? I mean, it seems like there were, certain companies when everyone found that, you could look on the internet, like what was it that made you want to start this? What was the void in the market that you saw?
Yeah, I definitely felt like nothing like this existed back when I needed it. And my own career story is very much that winding path that a lot of people experience. My family moved to the Washington, D.C. area from Dallas, Texas, and Los Angeles, California, which are two very different places. But we moved to D.C. when I was like 13. And I became fascinated by that television show Alias, where Jennifer Garner played a double agent. And I loved history. I was starting to fall in love with international relations as a space. And so pretty early on, I thought, well, maybe I'll be an ambassador or a State Department official, or I could work at a big global nonprofit. I could be a CIA agent. I thought my career path laid in international relations. And so I made all the decisions, majored in political science. I studied French and then Turkish language. I had a bunch of internships in the space. And luckily, in 2007, I had the chance to work at what I thought was my dream job. I was assigned to the US Embassy in Nicosia, Cyprus, in the Mediterranean, as part of the regional security office, part of the embassy. And I showed up, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, so excited. And I realized pretty quickly, this job is not what I thought it was at all. And actually, frankly, like I'm very entrepreneurial in my personality. I love to like build and create and test and experiment. And the US government has a lot of, for very good reasons, bureaucracy. Surprise, surprise. But I realized at the age of 22 that I had one idea of what I thought that my career would be like, and it wasn't at all matching the reality. And I was floored. And so I started looking online. I started talking to people. I was thinking, well, if it's not this, what do I want to do? And I realized it's really hard to figure out what your career should be. Indeed was the dominant job search site at the time, alongside monster.com and LinkedIn. And pretty much all of them just gave you these laundry lists of job. And there was all in there, all this information about what qualifications I should have and what skills I needed to have. Great. But there was nothing about why I would want to work for that company. Why should I choose your job out of, 5,732 other search results that just came up? And I was getting a taste for kind of high-end recruiting because I ended up going to work for McKinsey and Company in New York. And so these banks and hedge funds were spending thousands of dollars trying to get me to think about considering their roles after McKinsey. But it felt like there was this massive gap. Really white glove, red carpet recruiting on one side that was available only to companies that were spending huge amounts of money. And then very kind of lowest common denominator, really transactional recruiting on another side. And I thought there are so many people like me that care about where they work, that want to learn more about a company culture. And if only I could help companies tell their story, they could make better hires. I'm so sorry, by the way, recording in New York City, you might be able to hear that.
Oh, no.
But yeah, it was just, I felt like I could not be the only person with this problem. I could not be the only person who wanted to know more about whether a company would be a good fit. And as I started to talk to other people like me, I started a blog before the Muse that was several other women and I, and we weren't actually giving advice. We would go interview successful women about their career paths. And very quickly we had, 3,000 readers, and then 7,000, and then 10,000, and then 20,000 out of nowhere, it seemed. And it was because there was this deep kind of untapped demand for a totally new way of thinking about career. And when I started talking to companies, I realized a lot of them weren't happy with their hiring processes. They were just getting someone who wanted a paycheck, when for a lot of great companies, they wanted someone who was really opting in to their mission and their values and their way of doing things. And I thought, couldn't we make this better? I mean, it's a classic entrepreneur question. Couldn't you make this better?
Yeah. I mean, it's a classic entrepreneur question, but it's also, we were always just trained that like, you're lucky to get a job. And like, it's like, this is what you do. It's like, who am I to like question what they do? But now it's like, we all know that that's not going to work, and it's not going to make for a great career trajectory. It's not going to make for a good, balance at all, if there is one, like, and I think a lot of the younger generations are like, yeah, we're not even like remotely going to work for places where they think misogyny is okay and it's only white men at the top. And, even if it's like, because I did the same thing. I interviewed at some place who I thought was my like like absolute pinnacle. This is where I wanted to work, to be a music attorney. And I walked into an office with 27 white men all wearing suits in the music industry. And there was no women there at all, except for as they referred to them, their secretaries, when I asked where women were. And it's still a big, thriving music attorney place, where J-Lo and Taylor Swift and all these people, I mean, not Taylor, I don't think, but J-Lo, Lady Gaga, et cetera, are all at this firm. And it's literally 27 white men. And you're like,
Yeah.
what? Like, it's like, also, it's like, who do you want your clients to be? What do you want your day to be like? I don't want to have to dress for two different parts because I'm a lawyer, all those things.
Completely. And I think that the way people conceive of work and how it fits into their life has changed dramatically in the last, frankly, the last 3 years with COVID, really the last 5 to 10. It did used to be exactly what you said, work's work. If it was fun, they wouldn't pay you. Show up, get the paycheck. You can't ask for more. And that has been massively changing. And frankly, people always want to know why. Some people blamed it on the millennials. Now it's all about Gen Z. A big part is technology. You can see jobs, you can see inside different companies. Every single market that tech has entered, it increases the number of choices available. So of course, in an environment where people have not only more choices about their career, they have more information about every single choice. You can look on Instagram and see inside 25 different offices in your industry tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I think also interesting is that as companies have realized they're competing for talent, they've also upped their game in terms of how they treat their people and what they offer. And then on top of that, this theme of diversity, equity, and inclusion is so important. We did a survey recently on the Muse. Only 9% of users said they weren't factoring DEI into their job search in some way.
Right.
So people really work at more inclusive companies. They want to work at more respectful companies. And again, the individual factors that someone is prioritizing actually change quite dramatically. It's kind of like in relationships. Not everybody's looking for the same partner, and that's great, frankly. That's exactly as it should be. So there's no one silver bullet for companies to follow, but there are some big trends that that help you attract and keep talent. And then on top of that, I think, again, candidates are saying like, hey, I could work in a bunch of different places. Why should I choose you?
Yeah.
It's such an interesting change in the dynamics of the labor market. And companies are finding if someone, joins and doesn't like it, they're much more likely to leave in a short period of time as well.
Right. Well, now they have somewhere else to look. They can go back to the Muse and find the other job,
Yeah, exactly.
They didn't have that thing where people were caring about it. I mean, but you were really ahead of your time there then, though in 2011, right? So when you first started out, what was that like? Did you find early adoption? Did you find it was hard to grow? What was that trajectory?
Yeah, it was really interesting. The short answer is that it was easier than I thought it would be to get consumers on board, because I think people actually there was pent up demand and need for what we wanted, but it was very, very hard to get investors and to convince the broader market that this was needed. And so to basically, I guess, unpack that a bit, when I first launched the Muse, this was after, 2 or 3 months of developing it with my co-founders before we went live. And then we had been working together on this blog essentially beforehand for probably 8 or 9 months. That was kind of our first expression of the ideas behind the Muse. And when we launched the Muse, we had 20,000 people use the site in the first month. Zero marketing budget. None of us were connected. I mean, this was true word of mouth. People were telling their friends. There was so much excitement around what we were doing. And we were actually exclusively focused on women in those early days.
Right.
So I think that really with this sense that, women were telling each other, you got to check out this site. That part of the business really caught on like wildflower. And I love that we were early from a market perspective, but I think that that people have been thinking about their career differently for a long time, and the products and services just hadn't caught up. And we were the first to identify that. On the flip side, though, there was a reason that nobody else was offering what we were offering. And that's because a lot of the powers that be and the companies and the investors didn't believe it yet. And so firstly, within the space, I had a lot of people tell me, well, what's wrong with Monster? And, if people cared about where they worked, they should just basically shut up and be grateful for a paycheck. Like that's
exactly. Yeah.
Still a very dominant perspective. I was just on CNBC debating some guy who was like, if people, are going to get all precious about the values of a company, they should be lucky to put food on the table. I was like, wow, welcome to the 1980s. That era is gone, especially for knowledge workers and for higher quality talent. You can get, by the way, you can get someone to do your job. If you as an employer have this mindset that you're lucky just to be paid, you cannot get great people to do your job with that.
Exactly.
That is, that's what we're seeing kind of shake out. So my early pitches to investors were almost all met with rejection. I pitched over 148, actually I got over 148 no's in our first round of pitching. I think I had 3 yeses sprinkled among, so 151 pitches in total. It was brutal. I was incredibly demoralized. And yet, I would get these emails and these letters every day from people who were using the site who said, I can't believe this didn't exist sooner. This is exactly what I need. Thank you so much. You do this, help me with this. It was so clear that we were solving a real problem. And it was so clear that a lot of the people in power didn't see it. And by the way, that was partially structural. If you were an investor in 2011, 2012, who I was pitching, your career path was probably fairly linear. You went to a top school. You graduated with an econ or a finance major. You did 2 years in banking. You then went and got your MBA at Stanford or Wharton. Then you, potentially went back into banking, or you got tapped by your buddy to bring you into venture capital. Like, this was sort of the path into VC, and almost every single person I was pitching had followed that path.
Right.
That path is not necessarily, oh my goodness, what am I going to do with my life?
They don't know the issue.
Yeah,
it's just so crazy.
It's a different mentality. There's nothing wrong with saying, I want to work in finance. I want to, for example, maximize compensation or maximize prestige. That's a perfectly acceptable path. It's just not the only path. And so I think, though, it's a path that often blinded people to all of the other dynamics that were happening in the labor market. And so over and over and over again, I would pitch investors and be told, this isn't a real problem. The multiple people told me everyone gets poached. I was like, everyone does not get poached. That's hilarious. And by the way, there was also a fair bit of sexism. I was a 25, 26-year-old woman. My co-founders were similar age. We all met at McKinsey. So all kind of young women, and our target was women, and particularly women with jobs. So we also had a lot of things. I had a lot of things said directly to me, like, I don't think the market of women with jobs is big enough to sustain a venture-backed business. Ridiculous. People said things like, I see that you're having really, really impressive user growth, but I bet that it's all on the coast, because I don't think women outside of New York and LA really need a service like this in the same way. I was like, you mean a marketplace and a platform for women with jobs? Well, yeah, I just don't know that there's like the demand for this outside of these big coastal cities. I was like, let me tell you, I have cousins all across the country. I know people all across America. Women have jobs. Wake up. But there was this mindset, and I think it was more, I'm sure that there's still, unfortunately, vestiges of it today. But in 2012, it was shocking how many people, again, typically very wealthy, very successful, older white men, just their experience of gender and the workforce was such that they felt very comfortable saying out loud, without a trace of surprise or shame, that they just didn't think that many women were interested in this jobs thing. So luckily, we proved them wrong. I also, I went into debt to finance the business.
I was going to ask that. Like, you started this without raising money, right?
Yeah. I had saved a little bit. We're talking like, I think I had $20,000 in savings, which, and I guess depending on your frame of reference, it was a lot for a 25, 26-year-old. I had, jobs growing up. I was very lucky to get a full scholarship to college. So I did not have to spend my savings on college, which was, not true for a lot of my good friends. And the first kind of 2.5 years after college, I basically lived like I was making almost nothing and just socked every penny away. So I think most of that 20K I made in the 2 years before I kind of left corporate America and started my business. And so that was a seed capital for the Muse. And it also, by the way, had to pay, I didn't pay myself for the first year at all. So it was all my expenses. I ended up taking on, I think, around $15,000 in personal debt. That was pretty scary. I thought I was going to give myself a stress ulcer from just, we weren't making money. We hired our first employee, and I think I guaranteed her salary of like $3K a month out of my own bank account. So that then was accelerating, and I was pitching and I was pitching and I was going to investors, and I couldn't raise money. A really big turning point for us was November of 2011. We were accepted into Y Combinator, which was a big incubator. I found out years later we were the first all-female team to ever be accepted. It was, out of the 66 companies in our batch, 63 of them were all male teams, or maybe 60, 62. And then a couple were mixed gender, and we were the only and apparently the first all-female team. But that came with, at the time, I think it came with $170,000 investment. And I burst into tears when we got the news, because it meant that I could stop taking on more debt. I didn't pay the debt back for years, but I did get to stop digging the hole deeper at that point. And it also, just allowed us to, I think we brought on another 1 or 2 employees. We started, I don't think we started paying ourselves for a little while after that, but it was the first investment and the first kind of lifeline. And we were able to get a few other investors to come in alongside that, because the news of Y Combinator, it helped to get some people over the line.
And so when did you finally, so was that like your series, like a seed series or a series that yeah,
that was, it's funny, these days people are calling that kind of thing a pre-seed or an angel round.
Yeah.
There's all new terminology now. At the time,
there's like an avocado seed. No, I can't.
Exactly. At the time we called it a seed, although the very beginning it was the 170 from YC, and then I think we brought in 110K from other investors. Roughly, I could be missed, but I think it was 280 in total, which again, it's both a lot of money and, like, for startups, it's pretty tiny. So we immediately start, we go into the Y Combinator program. I had to move from New York to San Francisco for a couple months to kind of lead the team through that. It's a great program. You get access to a lot of people in Silicon Valley, both entrepreneurs and investors. My experience, again, I'm sure everyone's is different. My experience was that by and large, entrepreneurs tended to be pretty open, pretty welcoming, a little bit less cognizant of or weirded out or concerned by my gender. So, by and large, that time period was fascinating. It was tough. We were getting kind of great advice, and just there was really, really powerful community of other entrepreneurs. And at the same point, we were still getting rejected by almost every investor we spoke to. And so, I think that was a pretty tough time in the early days of the company, but we were getting so much feedback from people who loved the product, who needed what we were building, that that was really what powered me through. And
that's what kept you going to, I'm not gonna give up. I'm not gonna give in on that.
Yeah. And by the way, part of why I like to share this now is, I remember thinking, what if I'm not good enough to do this? I remember taking so much on and feeling like the fact that the business was struggling to raise capital, maybe it was my fault. If I could only find the right thing to say, if I only had better data, if I could only pitch it in just the perfect way, that all of our problems would be solved. And so I was really hard on myself. And, now looking back, of course, there's always things that you could do differently, that you could pitch differently. And it's really hard, and it's even harder for entrepreneurs that don't look like the kind of classic straight down the fairway, white guy Stanford dropout or Harvard dropout kind of archetype. I just like to share that because I think that, now looking back, it's easy to say, I'm glad I kept going. And by the way, sometimes you're building a product and it's not quite what the market wants. And so those are signals that I would say to listen to. But for us, I think we had really powerful signals from the people whose problems we were solving. And just, we had to get big enough for investors to take us seriously. So for the Muse, we actually had about 1 million people a month using the site when we finally raised our Series A.
How long was that after 2011?
Yeah, about 4.5 years, when we brought kind of serious venture capital into the business.
Right.
And, those early years, by the way, we would raise little bits of money here and there. Yeah. So we were making money from employers who were buying subscriptions to the Muse for hiring. And we were also essentially investing. I was constantly fundraising, and we would get, people here and there who signed in. Tyra Banks was an early investor. Eric Ries, the lead startup, was an early investor. So there were people that really supported us and helped us in those early days. And, we were trying to figure out, what is it going to take to really get this to the big time. And then finally, I think combination of the user base growing to a pretty sizable amount, it's hard for investors to ignore that there was a real need. And we finally cracked sales. So I sold the first, employer customers. We hired kind of a very inexperienced initial team of salespeople that had mixed success. And then in 2014, we hired our first head of sales, absolutely fantastic human by the name of Doug Freeman. And he helped build that first sales team that scaled revenue to, I think, about $1 million of bookings in 2014, I believe. And that helped us, that then helped us raise the A.
But it doesn't, when you look back, it's all amazing and it's all great, but doesn't get you a little bit frustrated that you're like, I had to prove that you could make money in order for this to happen, where traditionally we hear all these crazy stories where it's like a white guy is like, yeah, I have this great idea. Here's the money. You're like, you know what I mean? It's like, we have to show all the success. So you're like, okay, well, you're just like, there's no risk for you now, right? I've just basically shown you that you're going to make money back immediately. Well, not immediately.
Yeah,
You know what I'm saying?
It's really fascinating. I think that, there's a lot of research in corporate America that men get promoted based on potential, and women have to perform. They have to literally do the job to get the job. And I think we see a lot of the same dynamics in startups where, yes, there are women getting funded, but by and large, they're women that are actually doing the thing. Very, very, very few investors are taking flyers on female founders the way that they are taking flyers on male founders all the time. And by the way, I even saw this last summer. We had actually 2 potential acquisitions lined up in kind of exhaustive detail. And I was going out talking to private equity firms about backing a roll-up strategy, something that's done very, very commonly in a lot of industries. And, a huge number of investors were like, I'd really feel more comfortable if you bought your first multi-million-dollar company first and fully integrated it and got the business to profitability. And then we would be interested in backing this. And I was like, well, I bought 2 companies that are smaller. They're both very successful acquisitions. Here's all of the data. You've already seen it. And I actually can't go buy a company with multiple millions in revenue without a capital partner to do it. But, would I have gotten a different reception if I had been a dude? Maybe. Who knows, right?
My God.
Setting. But
I would really just like to deliver. Yeah. Just deliver me a Corvette, please.
Exactly. I was like, would you like it on a silver platter? Because that's what I'm hearing.
Oh my God. Did you end up finding the money?
We did, but that's a story for another time once I'm ready to tell it. Yeah.
Oh my God. No, I like so appreciate you telling these stories, and you have such a interesting purview in the fact that you've been doing this for over 12 years now, and with a tech company, which you bootstrap, but you obviously need to really scale. You really need capital inflections and and a lot of it. And so to completely have to crawl, claw your way into that constantly and keep at it with like a sunny disposition is, a positive disposition is like incredible, so how you've done that is amazing. So you're saying you're growing, you raised this money in 2014, you've incrementally raised, and then you went to private equity more recently, or you're going to, or you don't, yeah.
Yes. So we raised venture in 2015 and 16, and then a bit more that we didn't actually announce in 2019. So been through, several rounds of pitching, Silicon Valley, New York, venture capitalists. We were a marketplace business that did, I think, require a lot of investment to build both sides. It was interesting. Glassdoor is one of our biggest competitors. Most people listening probably, familiar with that business. The founder of Glassdoor actually had previously founded Zillow and Expedia. And, they raised $30 million before I think they had $1 million in revenue. So these businesses often take a lot of upfront capital. We had raised far less than that before our first $1 million, but we still definitely needed money to invest. We also have kind of a subscription business model. So you put a fair bit of capital investment in the form of salespeople, SDRs, B2B marketing upfront to acquire customers. And then they stay with you for years, paying monthly subscriptions. So that's been probably one of my biggest focus areas. We only switched to private equity this past summer as we started thinking about acquisitions and roll-ups and essentially acquiring other companies in our space to bring them together. And that's been really fascinating because, I think that if the Muse, we had a lot of competition quickly because since I was able to get press for what I was doing, but I wasn't able to get funding, we were in this kind of interesting situation of having a pretty big megaphone, which was really useful. It brought in clients, it brought in users. It helped with investment, frankly, because people would take us more seriously if they felt like we had a recognizable brand. So I really felt like I needed to be out there on TV, on stage, quoted in magazines, talking about the Muse, talking about the new world of work. And all that exposure meant that a lot of other people saw what we were doing. And so from the very early days, we've had tons of competition. And what was really interesting about last summer is I started to, as I was having conversations with a lot of the founders that run businesses that compete with us, started to see that there were potentially some opportunities to bring some of these companies together. We all sell to the same buyer, the employer, but we serve very different consumer groups. I mentioned Fairygodboss, the acquisition we did. They have this incredible community of women. And by the way, there's less than 5% overlap between the Muse community and the Fairygodboss community. We just serve different kind of psychographics consumers. I've also talked with, businesses that serve parents or veterans or people with disabilities and chronic conditions, or all of these other really important types of the sort of job seeker universe, which often have different needs, different preferences. They want to be in community with each other. But again, everyone's going after the same employers. So I think it's a really kind of interesting, it's an interesting opportunity for a roll up. And that's been kind of fun to lean into last year.
So let's go back just a tiny bit. For those look, a lot of female founded companies don't even get to the point of private equity, right? So can you talk a little bit about the difference of VC and private equity, what in actuality, what the difference is and what it, serves?
Yeah. So I think typically private equity doesn't become an option until a business is further along. Some people say 10 million in annual revenue. Some people say 20 million in annual revenue, but you usually need to be in at least that 10 to 20 million or more range for private equity to be an option. Venture capital is something that you can often raise much earlier. Some VCs invest in companies with no revenue, especially if they're run by guys. But often you have, true, sad but true. But you can be a company with very little revenue, but big dream, big vision, big ideas, and you can pitch to venture capitalists. They operate with a kind of portfolio approach where they may make 20 bets, so 20 investments in companies, and they may expect that 17 of those companies are going to go out of business. Then out of the other 3 that don't, one of them they're hoping is going to be massive, like Facebook, Uber, Airbnb, a huge money returner. Sometimes it's 100 times their money in. And then there's usually kind of 2 or 3 that are what they call singles or doubles. They return a little bit of money, not massive. There's a lot of upside and a lot of downside to this approach. The upside is they can take chances. They don't have to bet on a sure thing. They can back businesses and people and ideas that might work, or that, that might have a big chance of being huge, but that might not. And that's built into their model. The flip side, and the thing that I think a lot of founders don't realize, but should, is that most investors would rather increase the chance of you being a $1 billion company a little bit, even if it massively increases the chance of you going bankrupt. So for a founder, let's just say,
interesting.
I'll put this in some real or fake numbers, but to give you a real example. So let's say that you're a founder you have worked incredibly hard and you've built your business to, we'll just use 1 million in annual revenue, and you have an offer from a company to buy the business for $5 million. At this point, maybe you own half the business. Maybe, let's just say half for the sake of argument. That's $2.5 million in your pocket.
Yeah.
Most VCs would say, terrible, do not do that, because they're only going to make, let's say they own the other half, $2.5 million. That's like peanuts for a lot of VCs in terms of their fund dynamics. They would rather push you to turn that down, and which again, it can be a great choice. I'm trying to give people information on how this works, not necessarily cast any sort of value judgment. But a lot of investors would say, if I think there's a 20% chance that this company could be worth, $1 billion, or actually let's make it even more dramatic. For a lot of them, there's a 5% chance that this company could be worth $1 billion. But if we turn down this offer, 95% chance it's a zero. And again, like, you as an individual should be thinking about, what's my risk tolerance? What's my choice? When it's as clear cut as an offer on the table, sometimes it's easier for entrepreneurs to think that way. What gets tough is I've seen a lot of cases where an entrepreneur will have a great business at, again, let's say it's like 5 million in revenue, fantastic business. And if they continue on their course, they are highly likely to sell for maybe it's $20 million. So then that's, again, in the example, 10 million in the founder's pocket. And suddenly they or their team or someone has an idea. What if we invest in this speculative new area? Investors often are all in on that, because if that could kind of change the likelihood of outcome from a $20 million outcome to, a $200 million outcome, like, they're in the business of all in or nothing. But occasionally this leads to situations where founders who want to run their business perhaps a bit more conservatively get a tremendous amount of pressure to grow very fast, to raise a ton of money, to invest and spend a lot of that money in things that will chase growth, that will chase the potential for a massive outcome. Again, massive outcomes, fantastic, like, all about them. But I think for a lot of founders, they don't fully recognize that getting a lot of zeros is built into the investor's math. And getting a zero for them could be personally devastating, especially if they don't pay themselves enough along the way. If they take on a lot of expenses. Like, there were years when I massively underpaid myself, including after we had raised venture, because my mindset was like, everything on the table in the company. But of course, you start to realize at some point that these sort of investments are set up so, you could get a massive outcome. You could also have the opposite. And I think what we've been seeing, and part of why I'm bringing this up now, is in this downturn that started, last year in 2022, I've seen a huge number of founders who've been sort of caught unaware by how the math and how their potential outcomes change really dramatically in a down market versus an up market. Most investors get their money out before anyone else makes money. So I've seen cases where companies have sold for $100 million and, employees and founders don't make anything. There's something called a management carve out that's becoming popular now. I didn't even know that this existed 3 years ago, where if a company is going to potentially sell and it might be less than what investors would get, the leadership can insist on some sort of payout. But it becomes a very different game. And I think that I would just love as an industry for us to have more conversation about, yes, it's amazing when companies are billion-dollar outcomes, but there's a lot of people these days that have built companies that are selling for, $5, $10, $20 million, and they're not getting anything because of the way that they raised capital, the way that they spent capital, and the way that the dynamics these are structured. And that is the game. That's what you take on. But I think, my entire business with the Muse is all about informed consent. People should know what a company is like before they join. People should, opt in proactively to a company culture, a work environment. I think the same thing should be true of most things in life. But in this case, talking about investment, I just want founders to have more kind of clear eyes about where capital will go if first they take it, they spend it, and if they sell.
Yeah, you can't, and this is something that I talk a lot about, talk to like female founders who've started companies and they're like, but I did the creative side of the thing. I didn't like, I don't talk about cap tables and finance. I leave that to other people. It's like, if you're going to start a company, you have to get educated on this stuff, and you have to learn it. You have to learn it enough to know what's going to happen if something sells and not just rely on, the investors to tell you or your partners to tell you or whatever. And then another side of it is, if you're signing on to like become part of a company and perhaps as like CEO or C-suite and you're getting equity and a very, very low salary, you have to understand what that means too, right? I mean, you just open up a whole can of worms, and I know that we literally need to let you go because you're running this.
Oh my gosh, I do have to go, unfortunately, but
Yeah,
maybe we can do a round 2 later on, because this has been a lot of fun.
I know. Can you quickly say what your worst advice would be?
Oh, yes. Worst advice I've ever received. Early on in the Muse's history, a lot of people tried to tell me how to be a leader, and many of them tried to tell me how they would be a leader, or how
Yeah,
they thought leaders should act. That advice often included, your only responsibility is to maximize shareholder returns, and this was often in the context of, you don't have a responsibility to do the right thing or to your employees, or which it's just a philosophy I totally disagree with. I also had a lot of people giving me advice, to be less honest, to be less transparent or authentic. And look, there's a time and the place for everything. I certainly don't think that you should just air all your dirty laundry everywhere. But
yeah,
I think, being straightforward is a key part of who I am. And it's actually, I think, a key part of why my team works for the Muse, why people do business with us. And so I would just say that all the advice that I got early on about, how to be a good startup CEO, most of it, really keyed for what I would now characterize as like a old school alpha
yeah.
male, different approach. Like, I've
Love
gotten
it.
so much more comfortable in my own skin since I was like, no, thanks.
Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much. And if people want to find the Muse, how do they find you and the Muse?
Yeah, they can go to the Muse at www.themuse.com. They can find me on, let's see, Twitter at Kmin, Kmin, Instagram, Kminshew, Kminshew. I post a fair bit on LinkedIn, Kathryn Minshew. And also, please, since I know a lot of your listeners are women, love for them to check out Fairygodboss, just
Yeah.
fairygodboss.com, join the community. It's a really cool place, and obviously all the social channels, the Muse Fairygodboss, you can find us on all the big platforms. So yeah, I'd love for people to check it out and let us know what they think.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for listening to this episode of Taking Care of Lady Business. Until next time, I'm Jennifer Justice.